I came home, my son was already in bed. I went into his room to tuck him in, even though I think he was already asleep. And he asked me if I could go back to Miller Thompson. And I said, why?
Oh,
And he said, because I never see you anymore. And that just devastated me and made me realize that, I had to do what I had to do to make the firm a success.
From Sixth Story, I'm your producer, Diana Hong, and you're listening to Rev Up Your Potential with Hilda Gann, the show where we talk with the entrepreneur next door about the stories behind their success and the lessons they've learned along the way. Today's guest is a leading employment lawyer and mediator and the founder of Rudner Law, an award-winning law firm located in Markham, Ontario, that helps both the employer and the employee with employment law issues. In today's episode, he and Hilda will talk about why he left the corporate world to start his own firm, what his father taught him about business, the impact of having kids and wanting them to be proud of the work you do, and so much more. So please enjoy our conversation with Stuart Rudner.
welcome. Today, my guest is Stuart Rudner, a award-winning human resources, employment law, and mediation specialist who has his own company, Rudner Law. Welcome, Stuart, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me, Hilda. I'm really, really excited to be a guest. I love what you do about introducing us to other people in our community.
So for those people who don't know you, share a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a lawyer, and as I was recently reminded, I've been practicing law for 21 and a half years now, which is hard to believe. But I started off at a large firm doing general litigation, but slowly but surely evolved into an employment lawyer, where it was sort of 90% of what I did at the large firm. And then I made the decision to go out on my own 7 or 8 years ago now, focusing solely on employment law. So Rudner Law specializes in employment law. That's all we do, although it's more than enough to keep us busy. And we have a great team that works with our clients to make sure they understand not only the legalities, but we also focus on the practicalities. And I think we can talk more about that later, but I really try to instill in my team that we're advising clients, we're educating clients, and we're also advocating on their behalf. So we have a great team that specializes in employment law. And I'm also building up a mediation practice as well, which is becoming a large part of my day-to-day.
Let's go back to that comment that you made. You started in corporate law and then I started out on my own. What happened in that journey? What made you decide to go from being corporate and then starting your own business? Tell us a little bit about that part of your journey.
Yeah, that was an interesting and challenging time. I mean, I started off as a summer student at Miller Thompson. I articled there. I was an associate there. I became a partner there. I think a lot of people assumed I would be a lifer at that firm, as many people were. And it's a great firm, and I still have a lot of good friends that are there. But over time, there were a number of things that made me think that I would love to just leave and create my own practice. And part of it was just that entrepreneurial spirit of wanting to do things my own way. And I'm very tech savvy. So I like to involve technology. I like to do things more efficiently. And I know that in a big firm, it's often hard to do that. I was also mindful of things like hourly rates and costs at a large firm. And I like working with a lot of small to mid-sized businesses, and they often struggle to afford the costs of a big firm. The other big factor was probably conflicts of interest, where we'd have situations where I couldn't take on a new client because someone in, let's say, the Vancouver office of the firm had helped someone else on a totally unrelated matter 5 years ago, but because of that, I couldn't take it on. So a lot of work that I could have been doing, I had to give away. So those were some of the major factors that made me think that it was time to leave. But it was scary because there's a lot of comfort in being in a large firm where you have departments that look here. If your computer's not working, the IT department fixes it. Marketing is looked after by the marketing department. Running the firm, there's a dozen or dozens of people doing it. Whereas if you're going to go off on your own, you're wearing all of those hats. So it's a scary prospect. And it took me a while to actually take that idea and put it into action.
How long was that process of thinking that through and taking the leap of faith?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess it was probably in the back of my mind for years, but it really became a real idea that I thought about putting into action. It was probably about a year or so. Maybe a little bit less than that. It went a little bit quickly in some ways, and we can talk about this as well. I started off in a partnership, so there was timing in terms of getting into the partnership. So it went quickly once the decision was made, but the idea was in the back of my mind for quite a while.
You talked about wanting to be an entrepreneur. And I remember reading a little bit about you as I'm preparing, and that you have entrepreneur in your blood through your family. So can you tell us about that experience, like of your parents having their own business?
Yeah, and it's mostly on my dad's side. And so he was a partial owner of a wholesale bakery in Montreal. And unfortunately, he passed away very young when I was very young. So a lot of, I have some memories, but I've also heard a lot about him since then, particularly at the time when he passed away, and heard a lot of stories, but even after that. But, one of the things people always say is that he always had a smile on his face.
I think you do too.
I've heard that as well. And, I think that just comes down to both of my parents and a lot of other influences who just, their glass half full kind of approach to life. And I tend to look at things on the positive side and look at past the negatives. But one of the stories I kept hearing about my dad over and over again was the way he treated everyone equally and treated everyone with respect. And it didn't matter whether it was his biggest customer or the guy who was cleaning the machinery in the back. He treated everyone respectfully. And this is a great story that it was probably about 4 or 5 years after my dad passed away. And my mother shared this with me many years after that, how she was at work, again, about 5 years after my dad passed away. She got into a taxi. She was busy doing probably a million things as she usually does. And she only noticed about 5 minutes into the taxi ride that the meter wasn't on. So she asked the driver, what's going on and why isn't the meter on? And that's when he turned to her when they were stopped at a light and said, you may not remember me, but I recognize you. And I worked for your husband for many, many years. And he was such a wonderful man. He treated me so well. And he said, Mrs. Rudner, I could never take money from you. So it was just an incredible story about, the impression he left on his staff and his team. And I would love to be able to say that I have the same relationship with my team. I hope that I do. I'm thrilled that, we're several years into Rudner Law. No one has left. So I think that says a lot, but that really resonated with me as far as how you should treat everyone. And I'll add that, when I've interviewed for hiring lawyers, we always make sure that when somebody comes in for an interview, that they stay at reception for an unnecessarily lengthy period of time, because I want to know how they treat our receptionist. And if I find out later that they were sort of fawning all over me, but treating the receptionist like a servant, they're not coming back for a second interview.
I know you said you started off in general litigation and then you slowly migrated to become 90% HR. Why did you choose HR law of all the different law possibilities?
That is a great question. I wanted to be a lawyer starting from the time I was around 14. And for those people watching who remember the TV show LA Law, I will sort of embarrassingly, but I'll admit that was one of my motivations. I will now admit that it's got nothing to do with the real life or the real practice of law, of course. I don't drive around in the fancy car and my fancy suits and the convertible in LA. But that, I wanted to be a litigator. I wanted to go to court. I saw the death row trials. That was kind of what I originally thought I would do. So this was when I was in my mid-teens and I finished high school and I was in Montreal. So I went to CEGEP. And then I had to do undergrad before law school. And I honestly did not care what I studied in undergrad. It was just a means to an end. Mm-hmm. And someone said, well, why don't you study industrial relations? And I will admit, I had no idea what that was. But I looked at the course catalog. Unlike now, my daughter's just in her first year of university. It wasn't all online back then. So I actually got a thick brochure with a course catalog. And it was interesting. It was sort of partially management, partially sociology, partially economics. I thought it would be a good way to basically kill a few years before law school. But as luck would have it, one of the courses was an employment law course. And I had a great prof. And it just really, I loved the course. I really, really enjoyed it. So I finished that, went to law school, like I mentioned before, articled at Miller Thomson, and sort of split my time between labor and litigation. And then it was interesting because I had the choice of coming back as an associate in either labor or litigation. And the downside with labor at the time was it was strictly labor and grievances and tribunals, which meant you'd never go to court. And I wanted to go to court. So I chose the litigation option, and I was a litigation associate for many years. But like I said, slowly but surely, I started to take on more employment law cases. We had a lawyer there, John Sproat, who is now a judge. He was one of the leading employment lawyers in Canada. And I learned a lot from him and working with him. And when he went to the bench, tried to fill that void. So that's why it became a big part of my practice. And then the great thing is when I left Miller Thompson, as I said to a lot of our clients, I was always an employment lawyer, or at least I was for many years, but I went from being just an employment lawyer to also being an employer. And all of a sudden I got it. When I talk to my clients and they'd talk about their challenges and their concerns as an employer, as somebody running a business, all of a sudden I got it because I was also an employer. I was trying to run a small business. And like you said before, wearing every hat. So that worked out really well, that I sort of had that background and gradually got to where I am today, where I'm running my own business, which is strictly an employment law firm.
What would you say are some of those struggles or points of anxiety for you as a startup business in those early years?
Yeah, well, you go from the security of being at a large firm where you're paid very well and you don't have to worry, like I said before, about any of the administrative side of the practice. You come in, you do good work, you try to bring in new work, and then you go home at the end of the day. So the biggest concern was, what if this doesn't work out? What if all of a sudden I don't have money for my son to play hockey or my daughter to do her dancing or for all the other things that we like to do? Or what if I don't have time for any of that? And that was, in many ways a bigger concern. I knew that when I left Miller Thompson, I'd established a good reputation. I was fairly confident that things would work out, at least over time. But I also did not want to lose the fact that I like being part of my kid's life and spending time with my wife. And that was a big challenge. And you mentioned before about tearing up. This might make me tear up because I still remember this very well. So I distinctly remember about 8 months into my time at Rudner McDonald, and I was working extremely long hours and also commuting downtown every day. So leaving when it was dark, coming home when it was dark, really not seeing my wife and kids at all. And I came home, my son was already in bed. I guess he was, how many years ago was this? About 8 years ago. So he was probably about 7. And went into his room to tuck him in, even though I think he was already asleep. And he asked me if I could go back to Miller Thompson. And I said, why? And he said, because I never see you anymore. And that just devastated me and made me realize that, I had to do what I had to do to make the firm a success, but I also had to make sure to find ways to be at home, be with them. And that was part of why at the time our office was downtown. And I was really adamant that we needed to have a Markham office. So at least I wasn't commuting as long, but also find ways to not do everything myself. So that was, perhaps one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think it's always hard to balance that family and business. And when you start your own business, you really do want to make it successful. What made you decide to make client service a foremost foundation of your law firm?
Yeah, to me, that's just, I guess there's two reasons. One is I just think people appreciate it, and I like to have that connection with people. And that's one of my favorite things as an employment lawyer is developing a long-term relationship where we are seen as a strategic partner of the business. And that's, a lot of our time, of course, is spent putting out fires and dealing with the wrongful dismissals and the harassment claims and everything else. But I think what we really love to do, and I think all of the lawyers on our team would say this, is the strategic work where we'll sit down and we'll talk about how, if you go to our website, there's a strategic HR section. We'll talk about using contracts and policies. And we really try to educate our clients on how they can do things, not only to spot issues and know when to call us, but also how to prevent them. So that to me is really great. That's really great client service. And an example from 2020 and pandemic is, we've been putting temporary layoff clauses in our contracts for years. And in many cases, clients just kind of glossed over it, didn't really think about it. We had a lot of clients actually push back and say, well, why is that in there? And that's not our culture. And we don't lay people off, and I don't want that in there. And we would usually say, we recommend keeping it in there just in case. Of course, we never imagined this just in case of a pandemic.
This was the just in case, right? Yeah.
But this is it. And it's been great because we've had a number of clients call and say, you know what, I thought it was ridiculous that you put that in our contract, but I'm so glad you did, because now we have this flexibility that we've lost 80% of our revenue. We can lay people off temporarily without this worry that they're going to sue us for constructive dismissal, without having to go through the hassle of getting some sort of written agreement. So we love being proactive with our clients. And that to me is a big part of the customer service. And look, to be practical as well, if you give good service, it usually leads to more business because you will get referrals.
Exactly.
And the vast majority of our clients still come through referrals. So it's really in everyone's best interests.
I want to talk a little bit about your philanthropy. You're giving back to the community, society, and the charity that work that you do, because I think that's also a huge part of who you are, Stuart. So share with us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, it's funny. So it's not something I've ever deliberately thought about, but I guess it was instilled with me. I mean, when I was growing up, my grandmother had volunteered at Mount Sinai Hospital in Montreal, and then my mother volunteered there. And then after my father passed away, my mother had to get a job, so she worked there. So I spent a lot of time there helping them do fundraising. And then, once I moved to Toronto and sort of had my own life, my own career, my own family, wanted them to understand that in many ways we are very fortunate and we live a very good life. And, my kids never have to worry about food on the table or clothes on their back or anything like that. But I wanted them to understand there are people that do. And that's really what kind of motivated me, I suppose, to try to give back and both financially and through time. And, like we were talking about before, I mean, I love doing presentations. I love speaking and educating on employment law. And sometimes it'll be, I did a webinar a few weeks ago for something like 1,000 people, but I've also gone to local libraries and spoken to 7 people just so they can understand, what their rights are in their employment relationship or what to look out for in a contract. And I've done, we've done a lot of work with 360 Kids, which provides great resources to homeless youth in York region, as well as United Way and a lot of other charities and not-for-profits where we donate our time. I mean, even the HRPA, Human Resources Professionals Association, we donate a lot of our time to teaching, educating, writing, but also, if you can, then helping out financially, especially in times like we're going through now. And we just made the decision, we typically send out gifts to a lot of our clients and a lot of our good referral sources. And we just made the decision that instead of sending out gifts, we're going to make donations to 360 Kids as well as to another homeless shelter to help people out at this really, really critical time in our society. So I've tried to instill that in my family, and I'm very proud of both of my kids. I mean, it started with my daughter when it was time for her bat mitzvah, and she wanted a lot of kids to have a charitable project of some sort. I told her about 360 Kids. And so she did a ton of fundraising. We invited all of our guests. Instead of giving her gifts to donate to 360 Kids, she donated a lot of the money she received to 360 Kids. I think it was something like $6,000 altogether that was raised for them. And my son followed in her footsteps when he had his bar mitzvah, did the same thing. So we've donated a lot of money, but also a lot of time. Every year, unfortunately, we can't do it this year, but every year around this time, we close the office for a day and everybody in my firm goes to 360 Kids and we prepare a holiday meal and then we serve the meal to the youth there. We also help them organize their donations and really just help out with anything they need. But we spend a day there. So instead of just writing a check, we actually get to know the people that are benefiting from their services, which, really, really means a lot. And I know everyone in the firm loves it. And, everyone's kind of disappointed we can't do it this year. But that's important. If there's a way to help the community, then you should take advantage of that.
I want to touch too, lastly, upon your growth in terms of technology. You always said you liked technology. And I remember one of the earlier HRPA law sessions that I went to way back when, that you talked about starting social media when people didn't even know what social media is.
It started back when I was at Miller Thompson, so it's probably a good 10 years ago, believe it or not. I would have to go look at when I signed on to LinkedIn. But I've always been a bit of a techie, so I like technology. And when people started to talk about, I think it was LinkedIn and Twitter, and initially I thought this is not at all relevant to the practice of law or anything I do. But then I started to look into it more, and there was someone who invited me to join LinkedIn very early on. And I did it to be polite because they were a client. But then I started to see what it could do and started to make connections. And then at one point, they have groups on LinkedIn, of course, but there was no Canadian employment law or Canadian HR law group that I could find. So I started one, and it's still there. It's a Canadian HR law group. And it was a fascinating experience because for months, it was like talking to myself, where I would post a topic, I would comment, I would respond. Nobody else participated. I was actually going to shut the group down. And I'm not sure what happened, but we started to get a few little comments here and there, and then it just sort of grew on itself. And we're now, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but last time I checked, we were over 16,000 members.
Wow, impressive.
And it's a good mix of of owners, business owners, of HR folks, employment lawyers, and people will post questions and people will respond. And it's a great way to go and just sort of pick people's brains online. And so using LinkedIn, using Twitter, Facebook, Instagram now, it's a great way to get messages out there. It's inexpensive, but you also have to figure out how to do it well. And that's obviously changed a lot over the years.
Well, especially in the last 6 months, it's just inundated with novices and experienced people commenting and taking up space for us to decide, who do I want to listen to? Who do I want to open up and hear?
Yeah, that's the key thing, is finding the good resources. But it's also a great way to make connections. So I'll try, if someone comments on something I post, I'll try to engage them in a discussion and then ideally take it offline. And on the old days, I try to meet for a coffee. Now, at least we'll try to arrange for a Zoom meeting, but get to know someone, because in many cases, they might be able to refer work to us. In many cases, we'll refer work to them, or they can become a client in some cases. But it's a great way to build your network. But I think the key is taking it offline at some point, because at some point you can only do so much by sending text messages back and forth on LinkedIn.
So before we end, I really do want to ask you this question, because people will say, you talked for so long, Hilda, you never asked this employment lawyer about the thing that's bugging the hell out of me while I'm trying to survive through COVID. So you have received, I'm sure, many phone calls almost on a daily basis about some aspect from a human resources law perspective and COVID-19. Can you share probably one or two of the most common reasons people call, and maybe a tidbit of general advice? And I understand this is not legal advice. You can use your corollary, but I know this is just some information he's sharing.
Yeah, no, look, like I said at the very beginning, we're lucky we've been very, very busy this year because of all the workplace issues that arose out of COVID-19. But it's been fascinating because, people had to really turn on a dime in some cases in March and April. And we saw these massive layoffs or people having their hours cut. And the problem there was most, and I've said this very publicly, most businesses did not have the right to impose temporary layoffs. Yeah. And they take a risk, and there's still a risk because people have 2 years to file a claim. There's still a risk of a constructive dismissal claim. So initially, the people that did take the time to call were asking, how do we, can we lay people off? Can we reduce their hours? Yeah. Or from the employee's side, can my employer do this? That was the initial phase. And then we went to the kind of getting back to business phase of, okay, now, and unfortunately, it looks like we're going the other way again, but we were opening back up. So people would call and say, well, how do I recall people? Do I have to do it based on seniority, or can I just pick and choose who I want? And that was, the key question. Or from the employee side, I was actually amazed how many people just, did not want to go back to work. And we'd have so many employer clients calling us saying, my people won't come back to work. What do I do? What can I do? But you know what? We thought about this and we talk about this as a group at our firm, it all gets back to one of the biggest issues that we see, COVID times or non-COVID times, which is this, failure to understand the legal obligations of an employment relationship. And the reason for that is people don't think of their employment relationships as a legal relationship. So I know when you're a business person, you're hiring or you're having to downsize. But of course, we see that as engaging in a contract, an employment contract. People don't realize that. And as soon as you put it in that, that context, you realize that you need to make sure your contracts are properly drafted. You need to check your contracts to know what your rights are and also what they're not. And people overestimate their rights, employers who assume they can lay people off. And then people underestimate their rights. The same employers who assume that they have the right to lay people off without checking now don't think they can insist that people come back to work, even though they probably can. So it's just fascinating to us that, most people get into trouble really because they don't take the time to understand their rights. And it's no different now than it is in normal times.
And what I found too through my clients and through, the podcasts that I do and webinars, there are people that don't even have contracts, like, oh my God, you don't even have a contract with your employee and they've been with you for 5 years. Like, okay, let's see what we can do about this now.
Yeah, and amazing. That's not uncommon at all. I mean, the vast majority of people.
I know.
And here's the other misconception: when and I know what you mean when you say it, that they don't have a written contract. But what people don't realize is every single employee has a contract.
Yes.
It's just that the vast majority are verbal. And from the employer perspective, that's not a good thing because that contract is comprised of whatever you discussed. So typically title, salary, perhaps vacation, and then a whole bunch of other things that are implied by law. And those are things that are designed to protect the employee, not the employer. And that's where I know we talked a bit about strategic HR. That's where strategic HR really comes in. But most people, most people don't get around to it, or they get burned once. And then they understand that they need to be more proactive.
It's been a pleasure. I think we covered a lot of interesting things. Thank you very much, Stuart. Before we leave, what are you up to now and how do people get a hold of you?
Yeah, I mean, what we're up to, we seem to be swamped with more COVID-19 related issues than we can handle. And we're actually looking to grow and add another lawyer to help us handle that. So, but, we're always here and available. And as far as how to get a hold of us, going to the website, rudnerlaw.ca is a good starting point. And you can sign up for our newsletters to get employment law updates in your inbox. But also you mentioned social media. We really do try to use our social media to educate people. So we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. We do a monthly show. And I know you've been on a guest on it, so you know this. But it's called Fire Away, where we bring in people with different backgrounds, different perspectives to talk about issues that would be relevant in the employment world. But I was also going to say that, it never hurts to reach out. So I find a lot of people, we offer a lot of free information, and I encourage everyone to take advantage of that. People are always scared of calling a lawyer and the legal fees and all that. And I totally understand it. As a business owner, I would be scared too. But it never hurts to call us. We're happy to talk to you. If we can help you, that's great. If we can't, we won't. And I should add as well, I know we're kind of trying to wrap up. The whole notion of the billable hour, I'm trying to get away from that as much as I possibly can. And I get it that, you don't want to retain someone and be told it's going to be X dollars an hour, but I have no idea how many hours it's going to be. So we try to do as much as we can based upon fixed fees or cost estimates. My point is just not to be scared to reach out to us. And if you're looking to find us, like I said, rudnerlaw.ca or any of our social media platforms, it should be very easy to find us with a quick Google search.
Well, thank you very much for a very, interesting session with you. And I'm sure the readers or listeners will enjoy listening to our interview today. So thanks again, Stuart, for coming.
Thank you so much. The time just flew by, but that was a great conversation. So thank you.